Aquino had one hand in the province, one hand in the national capital. Almost daily, he traveled the 60 miles to Manila to serve President Magsaysay and his successors, Presidents Garcia and Macapagal, all of whom predicted that Aquino would in time be president. Their successor, Ferdinand Marcos, took a less kindly view.
Marcos hated him, people used to say, because he saw himself in Ninoy.
Marcos undercut Aquino's social programs in Tarlac and accused Aquino of being a communist or in league with communists. After 4 increasingly repressive years of the Marcos presidency, in 1967, Aquino ran nationwide for a seat in the Senate of the Philippines. And he won. His admirers in the press called him Superboy.
Every one of us knew him because he had a long background in journalism. We knew he was bright. We knew he belonged to the right family. We know he talked fast, sharp, and being journalist, you said, we have to watch this guy.
When Ninoy was in the Senate, he was actively involved in a lot of government exposés for irregularities and corruption and abuses that not only involved the president, but even Imelda Marcos also at the time. And so Ninoy poised himself as the only really serious threat to the presidency.
There was almost an assumption that he would be president. He was the leader of the opposition party, and it was an assumption that the way the party swung back and forth, it would be his turn soon.
Events intruded. The United States, confidently relying on anti-communist methods developed by the CIA in the Philippines, escalated its war in Vietnam. Marcos promised his countrymen to stay out of the Vietnam War, but then made a deal with the U.S. President Lyndon Johnson. He sent Filipino soldiers to Vietnam in return for more arms, more money. Students in the Philippines protested the war and also Marcos's corruption of the ballot box in what became known as the First Quarter Storm. Some joined Marxist rebels who regrouped in the countryside under the banner of the New People's Army. Poverty was rampant. Corruption abounded.
I said to him, Ferdy, as long as you're working for the country, you can count on me 100%. Mr. President, I said, you know, your salary is not enough to keep a man in your position. I'll tell you what I'll do for you, I says. I will give you 20 million pesos a year, tax paid. And he said to me, how will you raise the money? Well, I said, you know, in the tobacco business, we have to mix Virginia tobacco with local brands. I says the manufacturers would happily pay me 1 peso or 1.50 a kilo of this tobacco. That is the money. I will pay the tax on it. I will pay the income on it, and then we'll turn over the money to you. No strings attached. You don't have to do anything for us. He says, you know, that's a very good idea. Okay. Then he turned over the idea to his group of people. So they started bringing in the tobacco, they brought in sardines, they brought in apples, they brought in everything you could think of and levied on it and made money. So that maybe I was partially to blame, no?
You'd think that the first $1 billion of siphoned off funds would be sufficient for any conceivable need or requirement he might have, personal or political. But it was like it kept feeding on itself, and there seemed to be no limit to his avarice or to his willingness to permit his cronies to enrich themselves at the expense of the Filipino people. At one point I coined the phrase kleptocracy to characterize the peculiar form of government that the Marcoses had established.
In the meantime, the Philippines, the brightest star in Southeast Asia, was slowly waning under this, economically waning, and the other countries were coming up, and that was in part a result of the corruption.
In 1972, Mr. Marcos was already 7 years in office. He had 1 year to go. He was toying with the idea of fielding Imelda, but Imelda showed very poor in the polls. So what did Mr. Marcos do? Change the Constitution.
On the floor of the Senate, Ninoy charged that Marcos was transforming democratic society into a garrison state. He famously predicted that Marcos was planning to impose martial law to extend himself in power beyond the constitutional limit of 8 years.
The United States, with enormous influence over its one-time colony, by now in the person of President Richard M. Nixon, closed its eyes.
And then, on September 23, midnight, Mr. Marcos went on television and said, "I, Ferdinand Marcos, acting as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, I now declare martial law and shall administer this country alone." On that day, democracy died.
And the first to be arrested was NINOY Aquino, of course, while he was having a Senate hearing at Manila Hilton, I think.
An army truck delivered all of his stuff, clothes, everything, including and up to a toothbrush. And my mother said, "Why are you returning his toothbrush?" And the female soldier said, he has no more need of it.
Martial law is law of the gun. He who has the gun is the law.
In jail, Aquino initially was surrounded by friends from the Liberal Party and independent-minded journalists. But one by one, his friends were let out or moved to new cells. Aquino was left to the one thing he seemed to fear: being alone.
For 7 years, I was not allowed to see the moon and the stars. I would walk and walk and walk across my room, just a room of about 4 meters by 5 meters, hoping that I'll get tired. And then when I get tired, I will fall asleep, knowing that tomorrow will be the same. I felt that I already earned my peace. I have done my best. I waited for 7 years and 7 months, and the Filipino people did not react. And they would even give me the impression that they love their chain and their slavery. What can one man do if the Filipino people love their slavery? If the Filipino people have lost their voice and would not say no to a tyrant, what can one man do? I have no army, I have no following, I have no money, I only have my indomitable spirit.
Aquino wrote attacks on martial law that were smuggled out and published internationally. The first public resistance to the abandonment of constitutional government. He was thrown into solitary confinement.
The greatest punishment that was given to him was not being in jail, but because they took him away from people. He just loved people. He glows when he talks to anybody, to you or to me or to the guards. And so what happened when they put him in isolation and they would not allow visitors? I think that was when it really hit him home.
When I saw him in Fort Magsaysay, he had to hold on to his pants, because they literally were falling off him.
With a light bulb, naked light bulb shining the whole night, 24 hours. He didn't know what time it was. He didn't know if it's day or night.